Hello everybody and welcome again to my channel. I wanted to make a few comments about the August 2016 JW broadcasting, specifically just the first part where the brother talks about loyalty. And he made an interesting statement. He said, "Soon we'll face events that will test your loyalty to Jehovah and to the organization." Now that's a funny statement because if he's referring to Armageddon, when something you've been waiting for your entire life comes, you would assume that would actually increase your loyalty to Jehovah and the organization. So he really can't be talking about that. What he must be talking about is all the bad press that the Watchtower is getting. The Australian Royal Commission, the inquiry in the UK into child sex abuse scandals, and so on and so forth. So when people find out that the Watchtower organization has indeed not reported multiple cases of child molestation, and oftentimes have indeed enabled the abusers to reoffend, I can see that certainly being something that would challenge someone's loyalty to an organization that so callously ignores such an evil thing. In fact, you would wonder how one could stay loyal to such an organization which shows on the most basic loyalty it has no loyalty to anything but to itself. So let's talk about the things that this brother says about loyalty. He talks about how you can show Jehovah your loyalty. The first way he talks about is by defending Jehovah. The example he uses is the story of Job, and when Elihu got mad at Job for basically declaring himself more righteous than God, and he defended Jehovah by straightening Job out. Well, it seems to me that there's a group of people today that are doing the same thing that Job did, and they own a big, huge publishing company, and they actually ask you to declare your loyalty to them, and that being loyal to them is the same thing as being loyal to Jehovah. So if Elihu were around today, I imagine he would have this same level of rage at the Watchtower Corporation that he does, or that he had at Job. The difference between the Watchtower Corporation and Job is that Job repented of his course of action, whereas the Watchtower does not, and today if Elihu came, they would disfellowship him, and then they would slander him. So for those of us who are making known what the Watchtower is doing, us who are whistleblowing, we are actually defending Jehovah far better than the organization that claims to represent him. The second thing for loyalty is be loyal to the faithful and discreet slave. Now here's a problem: is there's no scriptural there's no scriptural backing at all for this stance. The whole teaching of the faithful and discreet slave is based on a sweeping, huge interpretation of Matthew 24:45 through 47, and another scripture in Luke that talks about the steward. And then this scripture is misapplied and is used to basically give authority to men. So therefore, this is an unscriptural request to be loyal to the faithful and discreet slave. And how does he support this call for loyalty to the faithful and discreet slave? He says God is using them, so we should be loyal. Anybody can say that God is using them, so you have to be loyal to that individual, but not anybody can prove it. The faithful and discreet slave has repeatedly proved that they are not actually representing God, and they are not being used by him. And their own literature has borne this out. Anyways, moving on to some of his arguments, he uses the argument that, the governing body is imperfect, but this is no reason for us not to follow them. Well, every other religion has imperfect people in it. Therefore, if you're claiming that God's using you, there should be some sign that somehow you're directed by God. And using the excuse that the men are imperfect doesn't apply. You have to be held to a different standard. So making mistakes is not a sign of imperfect men. It's a sign that God is not using you. He says something about Jesus didn't say the slave would be infallible, but Jesus also never said to follow the slave. Jesus never gave any instructions that he was going to use the faithful and discreet slave, and that you had to associate with that particular group that they're associated with if you are to have salvation. So Jesus didn't say anything that would indicate that a group called the faithful and discreet slave should have any kind of power or that you need to follow them. So he didn't say they're infallible, but he also didn't say to follow them. But this brother goes on. He says that following the slave has a direct bearing on your friendship with God, and that it means your life. And he asks some interesting questions. He says, what if food is served that's not to our liking or that we don't understand? He doesn't say what if food is served that's wrong, because the Watchtower has a lengthy history of serving things that are wrong and of continually changing them and using the excuse that it's brighter light. Anyways, he compares the situation to when Jesus was teaching and people got stumbled when he said to eat his flesh and drink his blood, and he says that the apostles that stayed were loyal. So what he's actually doing here is he's comparing the organization to Jesus. This is a direct claim that the organization is inspired by God. Their whole request for loyalty to the organization is in fact a claim that they're inspired by God. So therefore they lose any ability to say that we have not said we are inspired prophets. This claim is a direct claim to be an inspired prophet of God. So if they're inspired prophets, let's pull out literature that I've used on this channel many times that was printed by them. Many of us remember this great book. I was there. I was very young when this was released. I thought this was a great thing at the time. I was a little kid. This was supposed to be the best book ever, yada yada. That was 1982. So based on this book, I never thought I would get out of elementary school. Not because I read the Bible and figured that out for myself, but because of this page right here. I've shown this many times. You can probably still get this in your Kingdom Hall library. I don't know. So this is page 154. Paragraph 8. It says, after drawing attention to the many things that have marked the period from 1914 onward, Jesus said, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things, including the end of this system, occur. Which generation did Jesus mean? He meant the generation of people who were living in 1914. Those persons yet remaining of that generation are now very old. However, some of them will still be alive to see the end of this wicked system. So of this we can be certain. Shortly now there will be a sudden end to all wickedness and wicked people at Armageddon. So you can reference that yourself. Unlike Brother Floden, I provide references and I ask you to check them. So we knew what generation meant back in the 80s. It meant the people that were born around a certain time. We use generation the way everybody else uses the term generation. However, God's inspired prophet, the Watchtower, who's asking for your loyalty, was wrong. So when they're wrong, they fall under the scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 20 through 22, where they are false prophets. Do not fear them. And they cannot use the excuse that it was just imperfect men, because if it's just imperfect men, then how can you trust anything that comes out of that organization? Anything they're teaching you is subject to be wrong at any time. And the excuse is they're imperfect men, but they want you to treat the organization as if it is inspired by God. If they want you to treat the organization like it's inspired, I recommend you do so. Follow the scriptures and treat the organization the way the scriptures say. Treat them as the false prophet that they so blatantly are, that they so blatantly are asking to be. If you really want to defend Jehovah, and if you really want to be loyal to Jehovah, you really have no other course of action at this point. As the boasts of the faithful and discreet slave get more and more grandiose, and their requests for service and loyalty become more and more direct. So anyways, that's another thing too, is if his third point was be loyal to the elders. And basically, again, he uses the imperfect men argument. He says, don't focus on their flaws, because following them is crucial to your spiritual health. So he basically makes it as if the elders are inspired too. And this is the whole mystique that the organization tries to wrap around them. And the Watchtower oftentimes would use the illustration of a white piece of paper with a black dot. Say, well, the paper's good, but just don't focus on the black dot. But the proper illustration for that would be, imagine if you dropped a white paper into ink and picked it up and was sopping wet, and maybe you saved a corner of it. Would you be able to use that paper? No, it's done. It's covered in black ink. You can't get the ink off. There's nothing that's useful for that paper anymore. Well, that's really the situation with the organization and the elders, not because the elders are trying to be bad people, but because they're in a system that is being led by a group of men that are acting as false prophets and that are putting themselves in the place of Christ in the Bible when you come right down to it. So if you actually want to be loyal to Jehovah the way they understand it, you actually would have to leave the organization. But when you come down to what they're really saying, keep in mind that what the organization really teaches, the effects of their teachings, is that Jehovah is the organization. And this video is more proof of that. They're equating loyalty to the organization with loyalty to Jehovah. The organization is, in fact, the God that Jehovah's Witnesses are worshiping. So if you want to worship a publishing company that has a track record over 130 years long of being wrong, of giving bad advice, of being abusive, of breaking up families, of causing people to die, then the list goes on, of protecting abusers, allowing people to be abused, causing people to stay in abusive relationships, then certainly, yes, feel free to give your loyalty to that entity. If you, however, have any shred of human decency, I recommend that you are not loyal to that organization at all, because they will not be loyal to you at all the second that you're no longer useful to them. So thanks for watching.